Well, hey there, everyone. It is Christy, and I am going to be very lazy because I've had a long day at work, and I'm going to read from my thesis, but I'm going to do it as a hangout because I'm even that much more lazy rather than doing it as a screen capture. But yeah, the fact is that I'm just really, really super tired, and I want to get this done and out of the way before we start, before I lose my momentum. And I'm working on getting to the spot where we need to be for this because I tried to increase the screen size so that you could see the text better, and what I ended up doing was losing my page. So what we're going to be doing in this episode is we have now, well, you've seen a lot of the work I've put into my thesis, which is one element of it is reading around the literature and the topics. And of course, I had to not only read in political science, but in psychology, and of course, understand how to put together a research design and a survey and collect data and all that. So the research itself took quite a long time, and that's why it took a while for me to set up the chapters. So really the first 3 chapters of the thesis. Sorry. So I'm going to stop coughing at you guys here pretty soon, I promise. The first 3 chapters really set up the rest of the thesis. So you've done all of the background work now, and we're going to be from here on in just dealing with the data that's come as a result of all of the knowledge I gathered through reading around the literature and thinking about the problem and bringing in new measures and designing a survey and working with an academic on a research proposal. We get funding, and I could do my thing and she could do her thing, and it was great. So all of this now was in aid of what we're going to do in this chapter and the next chapter, which is to actually get into the data. So in order to be scientific, of course, I've done exploratory, descriptive, and also inferential analysis in the last chapter. We looked a little bit at the crosstabs of descriptive statistics. We also examined how various sociodemographics predict a gender score, which is, inferential statistics. So now that we have an idea of basically the justification for treating agency and communion and also emotional vulnerability as a control variable as interval level measures rather than as categorical level measures, we can now use these measures and use the data that has been collected, this N of 20, over almost 2,900, I think 2,890 was the final number on the entire data set. And the first thing I do is I set up chapters 4 and 5, to examine whether or not when we introduce gender, does the sex variable change. Now, in this case, I've sort of set it up maybe in the reverse that you would expect, in which I have the phenomenon that it's harder for there to be a direct influence on. In this case, it's going to be turnout behavior, as opposed to attitudes and values, which would seem and are more related to a gender perspective. So in chapter 4, I'm going to be using theories to develop hypotheses that I will test, and I will evaluate the predictive power or the explanatory power of my variables when included in the model, and also compare when they're not included in the model. I'm just going to give you a bit of a, a bit of a preview and tell you that neither sex nor gender does a very good job of predicting whether or not you're going to vote because people don't turn out for, there aren't gendered drivers of turnout. Now, if you look in the aggregate, women do turn out at higher rates than men for a couple reasons, and that does include the fact that women live longer, and also that women are 51% of the population as a consequence. So women's higher turnout is really one pretty minuscule, and I can't think of a single instance where women voters as a group have changed an election outcome. But if you look on the individual level, which is what this data will be examining, individual level behaviors, we're not going to see a whole lot of explanatory power, but that also tells us something. Just like rational choice theory tells us that people don't vote because they're doing an internal utility calculation about what they can get out of, voting for this candidate. They do it for expressive reasons or for notions of civic duty, more emotional reasons, or they have policies that they want to see advanced, more expressively, rather than saying, oh, I'm going to affect the outcome of this election by voting. So we can use rational choice theory to say what it doesn't explain. And in this case, as we'll see as this chapter goes on, there's very little explanation provided. We're going to see more of an interaction effect with gender on attitudes and values in chapter 5. So all of that sort of setting up the idea that we're not going to see a whole lot of exciting results in this chapter, but the next chapter gets more exciting. And also, if I need to, again, step out of the role of reader and go into the role of explainer, I will say also, you really should watch my video on stats for people who don't do stats, because this thesis assumes that you know how to interpret the measures. And again, I'll step out and do some explanation, but I'll do less in this one than maybe in the last one, on the assumption that if you're really interested in understanding the statistics, you can just go watch the video that I made to help you understand the statistics. So getting on with chapter 4. And I'm going to only read the first section of this today because I'm tired, and also because I think I'm going to have to break this one up a bit more in order to explain it. So we're going to probably have at least 2 or 3, maybe even 4 sections of chapter 4. Chapter 4, Sex, Gender, and Political Behavior. In previous chapters, I have advanced the argument and initial findings that sex and gender are distinct concepts that must be measured and analyzed as separate variables in political analysis. But exactly when and how does an individual's biological sex account for the variance in his or her political behaviors? When and how does an individual's gender perspective account for the variance? In this chapter, I incorporate measures of gender into analysis of political behavior, using the measure to predict 2 aspects of political behavior: intention to vote and vote choice. Given that there was not an election held during the time period this survey was taken, January of 2007, I cannot measure voting behavior directly. Instead, I must use measures of people's intended turnout as their indication as to which party they would support, quote, if there were an election tomorrow, unquote. I argue that these 2 dependent variables are appropriate measures of political behavior because, although the survey was taken in the absence of a general election, and therefore actual turnout and vote choice could not be reported, both variables represent measures of the actions that individual respondents report they would have taken at the time the question was asked. The role of these measures in election turnout can only be assessed if these measures were included in a survey in the lead-up to the next general election. So I'm going to step out of my role here and say that these questions were asked to people who participated in the YouGov British Election Study panel after the general election, but we had all of because they're members of the studies panel, we have access to all of their individual responses in the time that they made them, so back during the general election. So yeah, just as a follow-up, I and 2 colleagues, one at Bath and one at Queen Mary, both in the UK, we applied for and received funding from the British Academy to replicate these findings from my doctoral thesis, but using panel data in order to test whether or not we can replicate these using actual survey data from people during an election period, which is what this sentence was about. And that should probably come out in like 2 years' time because we're all really, really busy. So we have the data. And now we just have to find the time to do the analysis and write it up. So probably sometime in 2016, 2017, that stuff will come out. All right, back to the doctoral thesis. The most extensive analysis of British turnout to date is provided in chapters 7 and 8 of Political Choice in Britain, in which the British Election Study team analysed measures that were included within the 2001 British Election Study, specifically to investigate the propensity for voting. In chapters 7 and 8 of Political Choice in Britain, Clark et al. Outline multiple theories which attempt to account for turnout. They then test the competing theoretical explanations with empirical models. I have taken the models for my analysis into the effects of sex and gender on voting propensity and vote choice from these chapters. Below, I review the concept of agency from previous chapters and derive testable hypotheses to predict an individual's propensity to vote. I then present the various models of turnout as analyzed by Clark et al. And briefly review their results. These models, insofar as it is possible, are replicated using the exploratory internet survey data from the main survey wave. In the initial model, I use the measure of sex, which is included in the original models, referred to throughout as Model 1. I then replicate the model, including the gender measures, agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability, which were reviewed in Chapter 3. The extended model is referred to throughout as Model 2. The results of Clark et al.'s analyses are compared with the results from my analyses of Models 1 and 2, with special attention given to the impact of the measures of agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability over and above the explanatory power of the control variable sex. The second section of this chapter generates additional hypotheses derived from theory regarding vote choice before including sex and gender into statistical analysis on the responses of people who indicated they would vote. This section includes one test for those who indicated they would vote for the Labour Party as compared to those who would vote for other parties, and a second test for those who reported they would vote for the Conservative Party versus other parties. The final section reviews the chapter's findings and synthesizes the information to draw conclusions. Turnout. Strong turnout in British general elections was taken for granted for much of the 20th century, ranging from a high of 84% in 1950 to 78% as late as 1992. However, that number fell to 59.4% in 2001 and 61.1% in 2005. This decline in turnout was noticed by political researchers, and it raised questions as to what sorts of factors are associated with the decision to participate in elections. Clark et al. Described political participation as, quote, a voluntary activity done by an individual acting alone or with others. Political participation is a means by which citizens express their political attitudes, beliefs, and opinions. It requires resources or skills, conveys information to public officials, and is purposive. That is, it attempts to achieve goals or implement policies, unquote. This conceptual definition of political participation is similar to the characterization of agency offered by other political researchers. David Bakken developed the concepts of agency and communion, and the concept of agency was later described by Marshall as, quote, an expression of independence through self-protection, self-assertion, and control of the environment, unquote. Given that an election is the time in which citizens have an opportunity to express their opinions and attempt to influence which party achieves political power, we can draw from the theory of agency to hypothesize that people who feel a stronger sense of agency will, all other things being equal, be more likely to vote in elections. There is no theoretical framework to predict how a communal perspective or one's emotional vulnerability would be linked with one's turnout behavior. Therefore, this section focuses upon the measure of agency and includes measures of communion and emotional vulnerability as control variables. We can therefore summarize the impact of an individual's sense of agency on their decision to vote as follows. Hypothesis 1. Agency scores, as measured by the subset of personal attributes questionnaire, will produce positive, statistically significant coefficients when included in models of voter intention to vote. Clark et al. Organized the various models they tested into two larger types, the sociological and the individual rationality frameworks. The sociological framework models, discussed in more detail below, are 1. The equity fairness model, 2. The social capital model, 3. The civic volunteerism model. Under the heading of the individual rationality framework, they test 4. The cognitive mobilization model, 5. The minimal rational choice model, and 6. The general incentives model. Not all of the models tested by Clark et al. Can be replicated here, as the British Election Study Survey instrument is far more extensive than our exploratory questionnaire. However, insofar as it is possible to replicate the measures of Clark et al. With the additional gender measures, I have done so. The first series of models to be examined are the sociological framework models. The sociological framework measures reflect the theoretical importance of an individual's social context, characteristics, and psychology when attempting to account for political behavior. The first model I analyze is the sociological perceived equity fairness model. This model posits that individuals who perceive a gap between what they expect from life and what they get out of it feel a sense of deprivation, and that it is this sense of deprivation which is the impetus for them to take action. Clark et al. Used the variable age and 5 measures of equity fairness to control for the association between voting propensity and age, an association that increases with respondents' age. Controlling for this association allows them to isolate and measure an individual's sense of deprivation. The model used by Clark et al. Is as follows. Voting equals some function of a constant plus B1 sense of deprivation, a Likert scale item of perception of the gap between what they expect out of life and what they get, plus a Likert scale item, does the government treat the respondent fairly? B2, economic deprivation, retrospective national economic evaluation. B3, or economic DEP, prospective economic evaluations, coefficient 4, economic reactions to personal economic conditions, B5, GovDis, government policy and satisfaction, plus the sum of all the variables 6 through 9, a member of a deprived group, where the member of a deprived group were more minorities, women, retired, or the unemployed, and age of the control variable. Clark et al. Predicted that high senses of deprivation, economic pessimism, and the national government's responsibility would mobilize people to turn out for the opposition party. They hypothesized that being a member of a deprived group would have a negative effect on turnout, encouraging abstention from either voting or protest voting. The result of analysis on 2001 British election study data indicated that the coefficients for retrospective economic evaluations, sex, ethnicity, and being a retiree were all statistically insignificant. The rest of the model's variables were statistically significant. Unemployment was related to a large decrease in the likelihood of turnout, as was policy dissatisfaction, a sense of relative deprivation, and negative emotional reactions to the respondents' household economy. A positive prospective economic evaluation increased the likelihood of turnout, and there was a statistically significant and positive relationship with the respondent's age. Overall, this model only accounted for a small amount of the variance in turnout, with a McFadden's R-squared of 0.08. Our dataset did not contain a variable for the respondent's ethnicity. Therefore, this analysis uses the religious denomination question as a proxy for being a member of a deprived group. As Western religions dominate in Britain, respondents were coded as being a member of a religious minority if they indicated they were a member of the following religions: Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, or Buddhism. My equity fairness model is: voting is some function of a constant plus Model 1 from Clark et al. Retrospective national economic evaluations, prospective national economic evaluations, member of deprived group, and age. Model 2, extended Clark et al. Model with the gender variables agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability. The dependent variable, intention to vote or not, requires the use of logistic regression, a statistical model which allows the researcher to test the ability of the independent variable to predict categorical outcomes. As stepwise procedures have been criticized for the influential effect of random variation in the data and for the inclusion or exclusion of variables for purely statistical and not theoretical reasons, all of the analyses in this chapter use the forced entry method to test all the predictor variables in one block while controlling for the explanatory effects of all other variables in the model. To test the independent effects, if any, of an individual's gender perspective on their likelihood to indicate they would vote, the first analysis is conducted using only the sex variable. A second model is then run using the three measures of gender, agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability. The range of the pseudo R-squared is reported from the Cox and Snell measure to the Nagel-Kirko measure. One other methodological note is needed regarding the classification of the categorical variables. Dichotomous variables, which include sex, being a member of a minority group, being or not, being retired or not, and being unemployed or not, are classified such that the reference group is 0 and the effect of being a member of that group is displayed as having a positive or negative effect. The results of the analysis of models 1 and 2 are displayed in table 4.1. The results of my model 1 indicate that a retrospective national economic evaluations have a positive and statistically significant relationship with the intention to vote. Age has a statistically significant positive effect, and unemployment has a statistically significant negative effect, both in line with the results of the British election study team. In the Clark et al. Model, being a female made voting more likely. In my results, being a female decreased the odds of a respondent indicating they would vote if an election were held that day. The model does not account for much of the variance in intention to vote. The Clark et al. Model produced a McFadden R-squared of 0.08. Using Cox and Snell and the Nagel-Kirko pseudo R-squared results, my partially replicated model can account for between 0.03 and 0.05 of the variance in intention to vote. Consider now that the Model 2 results presented in Table 4.1. Hypothesis 1, outlined above, predicts that agency will be statistically significant and positive in any model of intention to vote in which it is included. The evidence in Model 2 of Table 4.1 supports this prediction in the equity fairness model. Adding the 3 gender variables to the model has 2 effects. First, it has a negligible effect on the variance explained, increasing it marginally to between 3 and 6%. That 0.03 and 6 just mean 3 and 6. Second, the effect of adding agency to the model decreases the effect of being a female to the coefficient being the odds here, so the expected B of 0.57. So these measures here, where it says the B in the standard A, not the expected B, sorry. The expected B is the odds ratio, and I'm not going to talk about interpreting the odds ratio. We're just going to compare the coefficients here and their standard errors. Well, not really compare the standard errors, but we include that information to determine statistical significance, so I put it in there. Right. The effect, it actually decreases some of the explanatory power goes to agency then. So we see the effect of being a woman, which was negative, was smaller. So we're really picking up here on the sort of being a man makes you more likely to vote, but actually agency can make a contribution as well as being a man. So some women with higher agency are more likely to vote than women who have a lower sense of agency, or some men who have a lower level of agency. That's basically what it means. So. Right, so effect of adding to model decreases the effect of being a female to negative, smaller than in Model 1. So it's negative 0.57 down at 0.57, and in Model 1, when gender, agency, and communion were not, when agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability were not included, it was negative 0.67. This result indicates the complicated relationship between sex and gender. In this analysis, the agency measure does not drive out the sex effects, but it does reduce them. In addition to controlling for an individual's sense of their own agency, eliminates the statistical significance of the unemployment variable. The other variables from Model 1 remain statistically significant, and the coefficients, for the most part, remain stable in Model 2. A positive national retrospective evaluation increases the likelihood of intention to vote, while age increases the likely to vote. In addition, in comparison with all the other variables in the model, an increase or decrease in an individual's sense of agency has the largest positive or negative effect on their likelihood of reporting they would vote. The expected, the EXPB is 1.30. And again, because this isn't a stats course, I'm not going to go over how to interpret the odds ratios in a logistic regression result. But I will here, I'm sadly, because of, I think it's converted it over to an American style, the formatting from my original thesis, which is done on a British computer and British Word, which has a different size paper. It's kind of splits up the thing a little bit, but basically all you need to know here is this Model 1 is on the left-hand side, Model 2 is on the right. So here is the results when you don't include gender. As I mentioned in the paragraph, unemployment here is statistically significant, and it's has a negative effect. And being a woman, again, makes someone less likely. But when you control for how agentic you are, how much of your own sense of power you have, you can see that this now is not bolded because unemployment is no longer statistically significant. And it also has this impact of picking up in part on the variation that was previously given to the sex variable. So this is precisely what I was talking about in terms of sex being a bad proxy for gender, because what you're picking up on in terms of the variation, you don't actually know whether it's being driven by a biological factor or something to do with an agency, the gendered perspectives, as I like to call them. Right, so the next one is the second model, and the second model, I'm going to stop here before we get on to the second model, because getting through these models, as you can see, we've got to go through the formula of that basically operationalizes the concepts into metrics that we can use and inferential statistics, and then I have to give my version of it, and then I have to go through the results, and it gets a little bit heavy. So I think it's probably a little bit easier if I break this up into smaller bits and to let you guys kind of think about it, or maybe have a second listen if you didn't catch it the first time around. So that's it. We are into the data, and this is where we will be staying for this chapter and the next chapter, and if I change my mind and read chapter 6 in chapter 6 too, but since chapter 6 is really just testing gender gap theories and not contributing understanding to the sex variable as a proxy for gender, as I said, I might skip that and get on to the conclusion, which doesn't have any statistics, but will call back to all of these findings. Right, so now I am done. I am done for the day. I am done working. I've had a very good week. Thank you very much for asking. I'm very happy this week. I had my article. I can show you guys. Yeah, if you're sticking around. I have to go to +1 though, but actually, let's see. Yeah, I think I can go here to my page. I know you guys get to see what my Facebook thing looks like. Here we go. My page on YouTube. A lot of atheist groups, but I was really, really pleased. It takes a lot of work to get something published, and I finally got all of the technical issues. Apparently I like one hard return that I'd forgotten to take out of a table, so they sent me back the document to find this one hard return that I left in the table that I forgot to take out because I didn't see it, and upload a copy of our software. But this literally just came out it was published on the 9th, and I'm very, very happy making this contribution to variable harmonization documentation, which, if you are not a social scientist, will sound incredibly boring and unimportant. However, if you have any interest in the social sciences, or actually in the medical sciences or in sciences in general, a lot of times in the social sciences we end up, we do long-term studies, longitudinal studies over time, or we do comparative studies where we have metrics from across a lot of countries. And right now, if you are interested in doing a cross-national comparison, let's say you want to look at the effects of education on juvenile recidivism. Well, education is not as straightforward as you would think, because every country has its own educational system, and they are not always easily comparable. So that means you have to find a way to harmonize things that are very different into a structure that makes it closer to being like for like, so that when you do a comparison, you can actually say something meaningful. And that's all good to do, and people do that right now, and it's fantastic, and it's very useful. The problem is that the way that academia is run, the way that publications are run, that's really time-consuming work of harmonizing the education standards across 3 different countries is not very well documented, at least not in the process, like the methodology section or in the appendix, because usually there's a lot of other things that you have to talk about what you did with the data. You don't really have time or the word count to say how you got the data ready for analysis. And so what our software does that we're creating is it's a free and open source software, and it allows researchers to collate the metadata that they're using from various studies and to document that process of variable harmonization with one target variable and in potentially infinite number of source variables, and also to publish it so that their work can be cited and other people can get access to it. And the other thing our software does is it actually generates the syntax code in the 2 most popular software syntaxes, SPSS and Stata. That way, if I'm a researcher and I'm doing work in SPSS, but my colleague is doing it in Stata, if I do the harmonization work for a mutual project, when I generate the syntax out of CharmStats, it'll actually produce the syntax that my colleague needs to harmonize the variables in his data set without me having to do any of the work. The software does the work for you. So anyway, it's really big. Well, at least I think for me, it's going to be increasingly a big deal. Because I can see how this has very important applications to, let's say, well, one, just sociology, economics, measuring, the ways that you can convert currencies or convert employment or unemployment rates. All of that can now be documented in theory, with our software. And of course, combining things like medical studies with more subjective responses of happiness. Or I actually had a person from the World Food Organization, the UN, the World Health Organization, who does issues on like food security, too many oohs in one series of words, food security. And they were saying they have 3 different ways of measuring food or nutritional intake. So creating these sort of standardized ways of converting things between to make them comparable and to document all that. It's not something that is really sexy, and it doesn't get you a lot of cred as an academic, but it's absolutely vital to do. And the project that I'm managing is aiming to make the process easier, more transparent, and provide a reward to encourage researchers to submit their work for publication. And that was my day on Friday. I was being very happy about this and getting this out. So yeah, if you have insomnia, I'm sure this would be the perfect remedy. If you just start reading this aloud to yourself, by the time you get into it, it'll be well and truly, you'll be well and truly asleep. All right, guys, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. And thanks for listening to me talk about my little recently published article. It's kind of been the highlight of my week. And that's all that I think I have to say. So getting back to here, I guess I can just put the screen up because otherwise, no, I can stop broadcasting. You'll get my avatar. Stop. Yeah, okay. So guys, I've been Christy. You're always awesome. And if I can, after work tomorrow, I'll continue on. Otherwise, I'll just kind of be aiming to read this and get it done with by making videos, every day or every other day to finish this research up so that you can learn how it ends. They're different. You already know how it ends. All right, guys, I'll see you later.